Recently, the Conservative Party of Canada has urged the Canadian government to support an investigation into human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. In a joint statement, Michael Chong, Conservative Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Garnett Genuis, Conservative Shadow Minister for International Development and Human Rights, have said that even though the recently adopted UNHCR resolution is a step forward, many of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet's recommendations were not included. It is with pleasure that we welcome today on Montamil, Garnett Genuis. Garnett Genuis is a Conservative Member of Parliament for the riding of Sherwood Park Fort in Saskatchewan, Alberta. He also serves as the Shadow Minister for International Development and Human Rights. Thank you, MP Garnett Genuis, for joining us today. How are you?
Very well. It's great to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're championing for human rights issues around the globe, and you regularly raise the Tamil human rights issues in Sri Lanka. Tell us how you became involved in this issue in particular.
Well, it's through the hard work and advocacy of the Tamil community having brought this issue to my attention and that of many other members of Parliament. My passion for human rights issues in general is linked to my own family history. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. Both my wife's parents were born in Pakistan as members of religious minority communities there. So from a few different directions, I've grown up, and now in the context of my family relationship with my wife, kind of come to be aware of and develop this passion for standing up for the voiceless in Parliament, using the voice I have to speak for those who are in a vulnerable position around the world. And certainly the frustrating thing to see around the world is a lack of accountability for international crimes, and really some of the backsliding we're seeing in terms of human rights. Places like Sri Lanka, like Burma, where there was once a lot of hope, we're seeing a certain negative trajectory, and it's important for all of us to think about why that's happening and what we can do about it. And part of it, I think, has been the unwillingness of the international community to prioritize human rights, and so we need to do better at putting these issues on the agenda and making them a priority.
That is very true, and so it's a little of your life that brought you into this path, kind of. It's nice. Mm-hmm. Commonly, people talk about travel bans only, but you always refer to them as the Magnitsky sanctions. Could you please elaborate for the viewers what the Magnitsky sanctions entail and what else could possibly be under them?
Yeah, so Magnitsky sanctions are named after a Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was brutally killed by the Russian government. And this was a piece of political or sanctions technology that was kind of invented after his experience to say, historically, we thought of sanctions as being kind of a broader thing. You can't do business with anyone in a particular country. And there's been concerns about how kind of the breadth of traditional sanctions, if you like, might impact people that are not involved in those human rights abuses. They're themselves victims or just everyday people trying to go about their life in a country where human rights abuses are happening. The idea, therefore, the trend in sanctions is to be more and more targeted, to try to sanction specific individuals, specific businesses, specific government entities that are involved in human rights abuses. And Magnitsky sanctions focus on targeting and sanctioning individuals who are involved in gross violations of human rights. It includes, as part of it, a travel ban, as well as freezing the assets of that particular person in the country. These sanctions are obviously more effective if they're done in coordination, but when you have people across multiple countries that are sanctioning individuals involved in gross violations of human rights, that really limits the options of those people personally and financially, and it sends a message of accountability. It says if you cross certain thresholds in terms of the violations of human rights, then you will not be able to travel, move your money. It also, by the way, sends the message that to human rights abusers that they won't be able to escape if the political regime sort of turns against them. I think those that are involved in authoritarian regimes will understand well how sometimes the wheel can keep on turning and they can find themselves at the bottom of inconsistent politics, and that's why people in authoritarian regimes are often thinking about what their escape hatch might be. And Magnitsky sanctions say to them, if you cross a certain threshold in terms of human rights abuses, there's no escape hatch for you. You're going to have to stay at home and face the music. And that's a scary thing. So Magnitsky sanctions have a real impact in trying to end this sense of impunity around human rights abuses and tell potential abusers there will be consequences for your actions.
Given the demonstrated inability and unwillingness of the government of Sri Lanka to advance accountability at the national level, it is time for international action to ensure justice for international crimes. However, many of her recommendations are not in the resolutions, and your release says the same. How can Tamils expect any justice in the foreseeable future?
Well, my focus right now as an opposition politician in Canada is to get our government here to take a clear, principled stand. Ideally, we would have a strong response through collective bodies like the United Nations, and Canada should be putting that forward. The House of Commons passed a motion right before the last election calling for that international investigation into genocide, and we haven't heard anything from the government in terms of whether or not they've actually taken that idea forward. We know they co-sponsored this resolution, but there were things that we wanted to see included in this resolution that weren't, as you mentioned. So we're pushing the Canadian government to do better. My impression of our Liberal government right now is that they talk a good game, especially in the lead up to an election. They make significant commitments to the community, and then they just don't follow through. So I think what people in the community need to do on the domestic political front is look at their options, look at all parties, and hold their politicians accountable for the results. There's only so much the House of Commons can do without the government actually taking those calls from the House of Commons and pushing them forward. And again, talking a good game, but a real lack of action in the last 6 years on the Sri Lanka issue, but also on human rights in general. The other thing is Canada doesn't have to wait for international responses. We can use policy tools ourselves here, such as Magnitsky sanctions, as I've talked about. No officials connected with Sri Lanka have been sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act. Also, I think we can do a better job of drawing a clear line and not accepting violators of human rights to come here for different conferences. There was a peacekeeping conference in Vancouver during the tenure of the last parliament, and I know a lot of people in the Tamil community were frustrated about the government granting a waiver under which people could come here without fear of prosecution for international crimes. So there are international steps that Canada can take, but there are domestic steps that we can take in terms of being clear about where we stand on international human rights. And I don't think in many cases we're even taking those steps. So we can do a lot better, and we can expect a lot better from the government. And people should hold members of parliament and members of the government accountable for what has been done and what has not been done in recent years.
You've mentioned the House of Commons that passed a motion. Just for the viewers, the House of Commons unanimously passed a motion in 2019 calling on the United Nations to establish an international and independent investigation of genocide committed against Tamils in Sri Lanka. You said nothing happened, like nothing came out of it. What's the current status on that motion?
Yeah, so that motion passed. It was a statement to the House of Commons, and we have submitted what's called a written question, which is everyone's sort of familiar with question period, where you ask verbal questions and oftentimes you don't get much of a response. So another tool you can use is submit written questions. So another conservative colleague of mine from Alberta, Arnold Viersen, someone who's been involved in Tamil human rights issues as well, submitted a written question to the government asking what steps, what meetings, what action has happened since the passage of that motion by the House of Commons. And we haven't received a response yet, and certainly we'll be releasing that as soon as we do receive a response. I can't say that no conversations have happened coming out of that motion, but certainly there's been no action that we've know of or that the government's announced. So we'll have more information once, hopefully soon we'll receive the response to that written question. We'll have more information, but there's really no indication that the government has been championing the idea of a genocide investigation. Of course, there are components in this resolution that talk about gathering evidence and so forth, but it's not really at the core of the issue as the motion passed by the House of Commons was.
Okay. So, as you've said, the Conservatives continue to ask for an independent international investigation into genocide. And as you've said, to date, the Trudeau government has not advocated for said investigation. What else can we possibly do to kickstart these investigations?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, when it comes to international UN level diplomacy, the actors there are countries, member states. And so what people here in Canada can do is ask if the government of Canada is carrying that voice in a strong enough way in those multilateral fora. And I think these conversations around human rights happening in multilateral fora are so critical, especially in a time when there's a coordinated effort by more authoritarian states led by China to redefine doctrines of international human rights and undermine the pressure that has been historically exerted through these bodies for the advancement of human rights. So Canada needs to be very engaged and fearless and principled. We can't just be showing up in order to show up. We have to really have a mission when we go into these international dialogues, which is about defending our fundamental values and human rights. What can people in the community do? Well, they need to push their elected officials to be part of taking that stand. And I think the frustrating thing for a lot of people is you have members of parliament and then you have the executive, right? And it's the executive, it's the prime minister, it's the government that really control the stand that Canada is taking in these international bodies. But you don't vote for the executive, you vote for your local member of parliament. So for a lot of people, they might have a liberal member of parliament who talks a good game, who makes statements in the House, those sorts of things. But the government, the executive, just doesn't seem to be pushing these human rights issues forward with the same intensity that they should be. We saw this on the Uyghur genocide motion, for example. You had individual Liberal MPs voting for that motion, but then the government, the ministers, the executive abstaining from that vote and failing to take that position. But I would encourage people as they think about the next election, as they think about how they vote and who they vote for, they need to think about who the government's going to be and whether the government is going to take those issues forward. It's just not good enough to have a member of parliament that's making nice statements about these issues. You need to have a government that's using our presence and our resources in international bodies to put these issues forward. So I think if we want to see a change, we need to see either a change in the attitude of the government or a change in government at the executive level. I think that's what it's really going to take to really put these issues on the agenda in a different way.
All right. The situation in Sri Lanka continues to be worrisome, and I know that many Canadian Tamils are gravely concerned about their family members' well-being. Do you have any messages for them?
Well, I've always deeply admired the commitment of people in the Tamil community to human rights advocacy, and I know that comes from personal experience, from those personal connections, but it also comes from a deep commitment to these underlying values, and I see how that advocacy extends to a commitment to human rights, not only in Sri Lanka, but a desire to see the expansion of human rights and of our human rights advocacy throughout the world. So I want to just encourage people to keep going, to be steadfast in your work, your advocacy on these issues, and it can be frustrating to see backsliding, but it is a long road, and it's always a long road, and I think people understand that in the Tamil community. I sometimes talk to people in other communities or who are new to politics, and they'll get involved in an issue for 6 months, and they'll be frustrated that they haven't managed to solve that problem. And I have to come back and say part of political advocacy is steadfastness and patience, and committed to doing that work for the long haul. But it's hard when you have family members suffering, and all we can do is to do the things we can do, right? Is to say, what are the opportunities I have to get involved, to meet with my elected officials, to participate in conversations that are happening, to educate my neighbors, to educate my colleagues, and if all of us do our part, if all of us do what we can do together, that's how we progress towards a better world.